Okay, let's talk about now from the other perspective. We talked about where the brain, the destructive mode, where we have too much glucose, too much insulin. Somebody in that boat, but they start to make changes to the diet, bring the carbs down, bring the sugars down, hopefully get rid of the sugars, start producing ketones. Let's hit it from that perspective, providing that other substrate for the brain and the changes that happen.
The growing majority of us in Western countries and many countries throughout the world now, most countries now are having what's called an insulin resistance pandemic. Most of us are walking around with some degree of insulin resistance. And what that means is that most of us are walking around with brains that are running low on energy, where they're not running at full capacity the way they should be. And the reason for that is they're having trouble turning glucose into energy. So if you're having trouble turning glucose into energy, your only hope in that situation is ketones, because more glucose is just going to make things worse. If you think, oh, my brain's not getting enough glucose energy, I need to eat more sugar to really power my brain better, what's going to happen? The glucose levels are going to go up even higher in the brain, causing even more damage. Your insulin level is going to go up even higher, causing even more insulin resistance. So now you've been having even more trouble burning glucose. So what I tell people is that the more sugary your diet is, the harder it becomes for your brain to turn that sugar into energy. Your only hope in that situation is ketones, because ketones cross easily into the brain and they can bridge that energy gap. Ketones love to burn. They burn best in a low insulin environment. And the insulin-resistant brain is a low insulin environment. So you don't need a lot of insulin to burn ketones. In fact, they burn better when the insulin is nice and low. So it's really, ketones are the best supplemental fuel source for the insulin-resistant, insulin-deficient brain.
Okay, somebody partaking in making this dietary change, starting to produce ketones for the brain, how much does it take to have a noticeable difference? And how long does it take?
In clinical practice, it depends on who you are, but it is very common to hear people say after just 3 days of getting into ketosis that they already notice, and that the number one phrase you'll hear from people is mental clarity. They feel clearer and sharper. They'll say, my brain just woke up from a long winter's nap, or I feel like everyone just turned the lights on, or I feel somebody just plugged my brain in. And they're not wrong. What's happening is their brain is finally getting enough energy. And all it takes is getting into ketosis, getting those ketone levels up in the blood to a high enough level that they cross into the brain and bridge that energy gap and bring those cells that have been sputtering along, trying to make do with glucose, but they're not able to really get enough energy out of the glucose. You've got these sputtering cells. If they haven't died yet, you can bring them back online with ketones. And that's a sensation that people notice. It's very noticeable. So 3 days is a very common turning point, but in some cases it may take a few weeks. And in some more unusual cases, it may take a couple of months, 2 or 3 months. But in my experience, it's a very noticeable process, and really in just a matter of days to weeks.
Okay, and then specific numbers people want to reach if they're measuring, and do you recommend people measure?
I do. If you can measure, if you can afford to measure and you're willing to measure, please do, especially in the beginning, in the early weeks, so that you can get a feel for how you have to change your diet and lifestyle and exercise and all that, how you need to eat and live to get into ketosis and stay there most of the time, which is going to mean different things for different people. So if you're not measuring, you won't really know where you're at and whether you're doing a good enough job, and whether it's actually, so a lot of people say, well, I've tried a ketogenic diet. It didn't work for me. Well, if you weren't measuring ketones, we don't actually know if you were trying it, because just lowering your carbohydrate is often not enough to get you into ketosis. So I recommend, if people can do this, to use a blood ketone meter. It's just a finger prick, or if you don't like to use your fingers, you can use your toe, a finger or toe prick. Just a tiny little drop of blood, and a ketone meter. These are not expensive. The meters themselves are not expensive. The strips can run into money over time, but it's really just in the first month or two when this is very important. Once you get the hang of it, you don't have to measure as often if you don't want to, right? But figuring out what to do, you want to look at this ketone meter, and you want those ketones. For best results, I recommend that people aim for between 1.0 and 3.0 millimoles per liter on the meter, between 1 and 3. You don't have to be there every minute of every day. It doesn't have to be perfect. And some people don't even need to get into that range, but most people will find that they're going to get their best results when they get those ketones higher, especially if they're trying to treat a serious mental health condition or a cognitive impairment, like mild cognitive impairment or early Alzheimer's. You do need a decent level of ketosis, we believe, in order to really make a big difference in how your brain gets energy.
In your book, you talk about one of the challenges of somebody making this transition is producing the ketones and maintaining them. For somebody that is measuring, trying the dietary approach we're going to get into more detail on today, but they're not getting the ketones, any specific strategies or hacks you found to be helpful to bridge that gap and really get into ketosis?
There are some great ketone boosting tips I'll give your listeners. There are 3 things that have to happen for you to get into ketosis. And so if you understand what those 3 things are, those are the levers you can pull to raise those ketone levels, right? So everybody knows you have to lower your carbohydrate. So eating extremely low carbohydrate is always step 1, because carbohydrates raise insulin a lot. And so if your insulin is too high, you can't make ketones. So the first thing is you need to get those glucose levels down. And that means keeping your carbs really low. For most people, I start at about 20 grams of carb per day, not all at one meal, spread out throughout the day. So very low carbohydrate, about 20 grams per day, is going to be right for most people.
And that's net, correct?
Okay. So that's a different question. So the way I think about it, or the way I like to advise people is, if you're eating real whole foods, you can use total carbs, and you can subtract the fiber. So total carbs minus fiber, you can do that for whole foods. For processed foods, anything with a label on it, where there's a number of ingredients in it. It's not a single ingredient food like a peach or a fish or an egg. If you're eating something out of a box or a can, or if you're eating a bar or anything like that, what you want to do then is you want to count the fiber. You want to do total carbs, including the fiber, including the sugar alcohols. Every carbohydrate in that food counts. And that's a big mistake that a lot of people make, is they count net carbs. They look on the box and they say, oh, let me subtract out the sugar alcohols. Let me subtract out the fiber. That's okay for whole foods. The different rules apply to processed foods, because the things that they add into that food, they often get absorbed into the bloodstream and they turn into sugar. Even some of the fiber can do that because it's not natural fiber. And so in any case, for processed foods, count every carbohydrate. For whole foods, you can subtract the fiber. And you want to aim for about 20 grams per day. So to get the glucose levels down, you bring the carbohydrates down. In most cases, to about 20 grams is going to be about right. But if you're still in ketosis, then you have to understand that there are 3 things that have to happen to get into ketosis before we make ketones. Lowering glucose is only step 1. Step 2 is you've got to get those insulin levels down. And carbohydrate is not the only thing that raises insulin. So if you're eating too frequently, if you're eating too much, even if you're eating only very strictly low carb foods, if you're eating too frequently or too much, that's going to raise your insulin levels. If you're eating too much protein, especially if you're eating powdered proteins, whey protein powder, casein protein powder, pea protein powder, powdered proteins are processed by the body differently and raise insulin levels more. So Carbohydrates raise insulin the most, but protein can also raise insulin substantially, especially the powdered proteins. So you want to make sure you're not overeating protein and that you're not overeating in general, because everything you eat raises insulin to some extent. And so you want to give your body time without processing all that food. So number one, get the glucose levels down. Number two, get the insulin levels down by making sure you're not overeating, making sure your protein's at the right range, not eating between meals, having a good, fasting window overnight. A good 12 to 16 hours is really good to get those insulin levels down. And then the third thing that needs to happen, so now you've got low glucose, low insulin. The third thing is you have to burn off a certain amount of stored starch in the liver. That's called glycogen. And exercise can help you do that. And fasting can help you do that. So if you're eating a really good, healthy, low carbohydrate diet, but you're not in ketosis, you might need to introduce some intermittent fasting. You might need to introduce some exercise. You might need to bring your protein down a little bit more. And you definitely want to be careful with any processed foods. And you want to be careful with sweeteners. Many sweeteners, even if they don't contain carbohydrate or calories, they can raise insulin levels too and kind of keep you hungrier and make you overeat. So those are the tips that I usually use to help people get into ketosis is, yes, make sure the carbs are where they need to be, but make sure the protein's where it needs to be. Make sure you're not eating too frequently. 3 times a day is more than enough for most people. Twice is better. And make sure you're not eating too late at night or too early in the morning. Give your body a break from food processing overnight for as long as you can, because when you're not eating anything at all, insulin levels drop like a stone. That's one of the most powerful ways to lower your insulin levels is to just not eat at all.
Okay, so when it comes to the insulin piece, it sounded like protein powders and certain sweeteners can spike insulin, not necessarily the glucose. Any other tricky foods in that category that can spike insulin we want to be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so the way to think about the way foods spike insulin is the thing that spikes insulin the most is refined carbohydrates. And after that is unrefined carbohydrates. After that is refined proteins. And then we have unrefined proteins. Even things like steak can raise insulin levels, even though there are no processed protein powders in there. Just the body needs some insulin to process protein, even from whole foods. So you've got refined carbohydrates, then whole carbohydrates, refined proteins, then whole proteins. And guess what doesn't raise insulin essentially almost not at all is fat. So that's why from a metabolic standpoint, from an insulin standpoint, fat is the safest and quietest macronutrient you can eat. So when you take the carbs out of your diet and replace them with fat, that goes a long way towards bringing those insulin levels down into a healthy fat burning range. You can't burn fat if your insulin levels are too high. Insulin tells your body to store fat, not to burn it. So you've got to bring the insulin levels down. And so if you understand which foods do that, then you can tweak your diet until you see those ketones show up on the meter.
Isn't fructose specific in this case where it doesn't spike glucose, but it spikes insulin? There's something special about the way that works in the body and it's metabolized.
Quite a few years ago, when I was first starting to write for my website, I did a whole three article series on fructose kind of being misunderstood. There's an argument out there that fructose is much more dangerous than glucose and is, processed differently by the liver. And it's true that fructose is processed differently by the liver. But in that series of articles, I argued that it really is not the boogeyman that people think it is. It's a natural sweetener that's found in all naturally sweet foods. It's found in fruit, of course, most famously, and sweet starchy vegetables like sweet potatoes contain fructose. If it tastes sweet and it comes from nature, that sweet taste is coming from the fructose molecule because glucose actually isn't very sweet. So potatoes are just lumps of glucose and rice is just lumps of glucose. They don't taste sweet, they taste starchy. But a sweet potato or a banana They don't just have glucose, they have fructose, and that's what makes them taste sweet. Fructose, all roads lead, that's kind of the way to think about it is fructose is different for the first couple of steps of its processing, but after that, all roads lead to glucose. Fructose turns into glucose and is processed the same way after those first couple of steps in metabolism. You can't tell the difference because it turns into glucose. So fructose turns into glucose. And really what's happening with fructose is that if you eat too much fructose, it turns into too much glucose. So all the experiments that show that fructose is worse for you are done under very unnatural conditions where fructose is isolated and tested as a single ingredient, which you don't find fructose isolated in nature. Fructose is never alone. Fructose is always accompanied by glucose. So these experiments that show that fructose is worse are exposing people to very unnatural situations that you would never encounter eating real food, or even processed food for that matter. So it's a hypothetical risk that I think is not worth worrying about. It's about counting your carbs, whether they're coming from fructose, glucose, sorbitol, maltitol, starch, wherever they're coming from, counting those carbs and getting them down, because all carbohydrates turn into glucose in the end.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
What if your healthy diet has been the problem all along? That's what a lot of people are discovering. There's real power in feeding your brain properly and letting it try